Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack. Now, I may not sound very Italian, but I am actually Italian of origin. As such, I am really passionate about the Italian car industry, and it has been really sad to see what has been happening to it in the last few years. In this video, I am going to talk about what's been happening, so we'll go through sort of a bit of historical data to show, sadly, I think, a big decline in that industry. But also, I will talk to you about the reasons why I think this has been happening. Be prepared as well, because as I've said, I am Italian and there will be much gesticulation and hand gestures throughout this video. So first of all, we're going to split it into two. We're going to look at Italy itself as a nation producing cars, which is a big part of its industry. After that, we will also look specifically at Italian manufacturers. So that includes production outside of Italy. Now, when we're looking at that, obviously, Italian manufacturers are now basically Fiat. So we'll be looking at the history of Fiat and how it's been performing. So to start with, let's look at Italy as a car producing country. In the 1960s and 70s, it was one of the largest car producing countries in the world. And by 1990, although the Italian car industry had suffered quite a few setbacks already, it was still the fifth largest nation in terms of car production, and it was producing 2 million vehicles per year. If we fast forward to last year, to 2021, Italy was just 20th in the world, producing only 800,000 cars per year, and that is behind such sort of automotive behemoths as Iran, Thailand and Turkey. They're all producing more cars than Italy. So my God, what is going on? Well, that gives you an indication of the Italian car industry. Let's look at Fiat specifically. Now, by 1968, Fiat had already swallowed up Autobianchi and Lancia. In 1969, it took over Ferrari. By 1986, Alfa Romeo. And in 1993, Maserati. So pretty much by 93, the Italian car industry was Fiat. In the late 50s, it was the third largest manufacturer in the world, behind only General Motors and Ford. It was actually in Europe larger than VW, and in Italy itself, in its home market, had a market share, a huge market share of 70%. And this is important for reasons that we will discuss later. By the 1990s, the first cracks were beginning to show, because Fiat only had a 14% share of the European market, and it was now behind Volkswagen, who was on 16%. Not only that, but its own market share in Italy, in its home market, had almost halved to 33%. Things kept on getting worse in the 2000s. Fiat was only the 11th largest manufacturer in the world. Its market share in Italy had gone down to 22%. At this stage, Fiat had already been overtaken by Renault, PSA, and even Suzuki in terms of volumes. In 2009, things changed a little bit because, by fortune in some ways, Fiat managed to acquire Chrysler for very little money, including Jeep and the other sub-brands. So that means that by 2013, Fiat was the second largest European car maker behind Volkswagen and seventh in the world. So in these years, there had been a bit of a respite. Also in the 2000s, General Motors had to pay off Fiat because it had made a commitment to buy Fiat, and in order to get out of that arrangement, had to pay Fiat $2 billion, which Marchionne, who was the boss of Fiat at the time, managed to reinvest and get a new product line going. So there was a bit of a resurgence in these years. The company, though, continued to face big problems, and by 2017 it was forced to do a merger with Peugeot Citroën, which I never quite understood. I never thought it was really the best sort of way forward for Fiat, but I understand why it was done. Marchionne had decided not to invest in electric because he didn't think it was going to be a fruitful way. It was going to be too expensive, and instead he sort of concentrated on trying to build alliances. He wanted Fiat to be bought up by another manufacturer, which was quite a weird tactic in my eyes. In any case, by 2017, there was this merger which was sort of 50-50, which if you consider what the Fiat brands encompassed, like Alfa Romeo, Lancia, Fiat, some really glorious stuff. I mean, I love Citroën. I love some of the hot Peugeots, but in terms of brands, it seemed that Peugeot were getting quite a lot. Mind you, they were bringing their sort of expertise in electric, which Fiat really badly needed. Now, at that stage, when the two were combined, Fiat and PSA, Stellantis, as I think it became known, was then the third largest manufacturer in the world by volume. It does seem, though, that things have continued to get worse, because by 2020, Fiat's market share in Italy had dropped to its lowest level ever, just 15%. Not just that, but last year it dropped 2 places from third largest manufacturer in the world to the 5th largest manufacturer, behind Hyundai, Volkswagen, General Motors and Toyota. Obviously, this is a very simplified rundown of what has happened so far, but it is also interesting to have a look at what happened with Alfa Romeo in the last 3 or 4 years. Alfa has been on the sort of the spearhead of Fiat's plans in terms of increasing volume. It's a manufacturer that has incredible resonance, and it is absolutely has been underperforming for years. In 2018, finally, there was 2 model ranges that were released that were actually very capable, and that is the Stelvio and the Giulia. For once, they weren't sort of languishing at the bottom of the charts in the class in terms of quality, in terms of build, and in terms of performance. And yet, when they were released, all that Alfa Romeo could do in 2018 was improve sales by 12%. Since then, production has plummeted from 80,000 odd units, which is incredibly low, in 2018, to 35,000 in 2020 and just 25,000 in 2021. Now, I know COVID is partly responsible for that, but those figures are truly dismal. So it seems that despite the successes of some of Fiat's products, like the Punto, the 500 and the Panda, the group as a whole seems to be absolutely unable to consistently provide results. It's always struggled to make any of the bigger cars a success. And if you look at examples like the Fiat Stilo, the Libra, and the modern Tipo, you can understand why. They were all products that were pretty much subpar. But there is a reason, I think, why we have got to the stage where we are today. Well, there are 3 main reasons that I want to talk about. Now, the first is a strange car tax that Italy had in place for a long time, no longer in place now, but for a long time. The second thing is more obvious. It's obviously quality, fit and finish that has had a big impact. Lastly, though, it is also about some gigantic, monumental mistakes that were made, especially in the last 20 years, to do with the model range. So let's talk about those 3 things specifically. First of all, for a long time, I think from the 1960s until the mid-90s, Italy had a tax which made it prohibitively expensive to buy any cars over the 2-litre mark. So that meant that if you were buying anything with a bigger engine than that, you were subject to a 38% purchase tax. So that made the Italian market was really, there was no incentive to sell cars with bigger engines on the Italian market. Now, as we've looked at before, historically, Fiat and the associated brands were hugely dependent on that market in terms of their sales. So this completely discouraged them from developing any of the bigger engines. So the only big sort of biggish V6 that I can think of, or anything above a normal 2-litre 4-cylinder, is the Alfa Romeo Busso V6, which traces back to the sort of late 70s. Aside from that, Fiat and the associated brands only ever produced, developed 4-cylinder engines. To try and compete with the Germans with the nice sort of inline 6s, 6-cylinders, V8s, all they did was simply to turbocharge the 2-litre engines. Now, this proved quite effective in terms of power. But if you look at the alternatives coming from the Germans, so from Mercedes, from BMW, they're big sort of 4-litre, the V8s, the V6s, the straight 6s, they all helped to raise the image of the sectors that they were in as a whole. So when you had a 3 Series and you had at the time the 325, for example, in the 80s, that was a 6-cylinder, and that raised it a notch above the competitors from Italy, which would be 2 litres maximum or 2-litre turbocharged. Now, of course, it wasn't just this that helped to sort of raise the image of this German brands, but having these halo models, these sort of bigger ranges, the 7 Series, the S-Class, did rub off on the makers as a whole, whereas with Fiat, Lancia, which should have been a competitor, for example, for those, or Alfa Romeo, the best they could do was to compete with a 3-litre V6 in terms of Alfa Romeo, and in terms of Lancia in the 90s with the Thema and so on, it would compete with a little sort of 2-litre blown engine, which, as I said, they were quite quick cars, but it just didn't have the same kind of aura about it as the multi-cylinder German engines. So that's the first thing really, and it's combined with the over-reliance on the home market. It meant that Italy never really produced the halo models necessary to get into the upper, more profitable ranges of the market. As a result, it tended to concentrate more and more on the lower end of the market. And now we come to the second point, and perhaps the biggest point of all, and that is in terms of quality. Now, we all know about the rust stories that really dogged the Italian car makers in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Now, I would say that today, those rust issues are definitely no longer evident, and Fiat is as good as, if not better, than many other makers in terms of rust protection. And in fact, it's interesting to know that in the 2000s, some of the German manufacturers, Mercedes in particular, really suffered from this. And Fiat at that time actually had better rust protection, and yet they've managed to shake that off pretty quickly. I don't know how they did that, but they did. Also, if we look at reliability though, quality and fit and finish, that is still problematic. Looking at the What Car sort of survey in terms of reliability for cars that are between 6 and 15 years old from last year, we can see that Fiat is still amongst the lowest in terms of customer satisfaction. It is 22nd on the list. But more worrying still is that Peugeot, who it was merged with, is 27th. So that doesn't offer much hope for the future. It seems to me that these are two car makers that both had quite big weaknesses, and they have merged together. If you look at the merger between, it's not a full merger I suppose, but between Renault and Nissan, those were two makers that had strengths in different areas. They were merged together, and as such, they produce a much sort of stronger whole. I don't think that's the case with this merger with Stellantis, which is really worrying. I know that Peugeot has made big strides in the last sort of 6 or 7 years. It makes much better cars, much better quality. So let's hope that they can do something. But I have to say, I'm not completely hopeful about that at this stage. On this though, let's end on a bit of a positive. In the same reliability survey from last year, the Alfa Romeo Giulia was actually ahead of the Audi A4 and of the Mercedes C-Class, its competitors, in terms of reliability, and that was something that's really good to see. It's a shame it hasn't really filtered down to sales though. Now the third point is perhaps less obvious, but I think it is one that's actually absolutely crucial to explaining why Fiat has dropped so low in the rankings, and that is that they have made consistent mistakes in terms of the product range that they were going to produce. So for years and years, they tried to match the Germans in crucial sectors, and they didn't produce products that were good enough to do that. So the sort of 3 Series sector, I don't know what you call that now, and the Golf sectors were two bits where Fiat really tried to push, both with Alfa, with Fiat and with Lancia, with some pretty dismal products on the whole, not totally, but they were never quite competitive. Things like the 155, the 156, the 159. 159 is a very pretty car, but not a very good car. The 156 had some success, but again, quality I think got in the way there. And crucially, it totally took its eye off the ball from one sector in particular that has proved to be indispensable, and that is the sort of crossover SUVs. Now, for a long time, Marchionne did say Fiat in 2004 when he came in. That is true. Fiat was in absolute dire straits, and he restructured it. And he made it much more competitive. But he always thought that SUVs were just a fad. So Fiat, for years and years, didn't do anything. It was only in 2018 that Fiat produced its own SUV in terms of the Stelvio for Alfa Romeo. And it made some bigger problems still. When Volkswagen took up other car makers, it didn't completely subdivide them into different slots. So when you have Volkswagen, you have Seat, you have Audi. There are some very differences at the extremes perhaps, but they produce a very similar model range. It's just priced differently, and yes, the cars look a bit different and they have some different materials perhaps. But when Fiat took over these car makers, it decided that it didn't want to cannibalize the sales of each one. So it took each of those makers out of segments altogether. So in order for Alfa Romeo not to compete with Fiat, for example, for a long time it didn't have an Alfa Romeo, a small Alfa Romeo. When it did, it was the Mito, which was pretty substandard. And a perfect example of this occurred with Lancia, which is perhaps Fiat's most neglected brand. Now, Lancia had an incredible history and success in rallying. The Delta Integrale was a brilliant car. And although there were problems with quality and all the rest of it, you know, that was something which was inestimable in terms of the marketing potential that it gave and the kudos that it gave Lancia. But Fiat decided when the Integrale stopped being made and the new Delta came out, it did make a hottish Delta, but it wasn't a proper Integrale. It wasn't four-wheel drive, it didn't rally. It just took it out of that because it thought that Alfa Romeo should be the only sporting brand, and that was a massive mistake. As a result, there are other issues of course, but as a result, Lancia has all but disappeared. It was just a misguided thing, and on top of that, the big thing, as I mentioned, was the SUV boom. Marchionne never thought that it was going to be something permanent, and Fiat lost about 15 years of that expanding market before it introduced the Tonale, and even now that it has produced it, does Fiat compete with the Tonale directly or with the Stelvio? No, it doesn't. Does Lancia? No, it doesn't. So it's just been, they've lost lots and lots of sales. As a result, they've had less money to invest. And it's just been misguided. I guess it's easy for me with hindsight to say this. I think I also believed at the time that SUVs made absolutely no sense. Well, we're going towards more of a sort of an energy efficient century. Why would you go for a car which weighs more, is less aerodynamic? It just makes no sense. But unfortunately, the buyer is king. And they decided that that was going to be what they wanted to buy. And Fiat was hardly offering anything in that market. In the past, although perhaps some of the cars weren't class leaders, they were at least in the class. You know, the Fiat Tipo of the sort of 1990s wasn't the best car in the world, but it was the roomiest and it still sold. But if you have nothing in the market, then you're not going to get the sales numbers. Now, it worries me greatly that we have seen this continued decline. I wish Stellantis all the best. I think there are some exciting models coming, and I hope, dearly hope, that they do manage to make strides and improve. But the whole thing does worry me. And I think one last telling thing, if we're talking about Italy in general, if we go back to the production of Italy itself, which probably is indicative of Fiat as well, you know, we're down to 20th in the world, 800,000 cars being produced. I think part of the reason for that is if you go back to 2010, there was one factory in Poland, there were 6 factories in Italy. The factory in Poland was producing almost as much in numbers as the 6 factories in Italy, but with 30% less workforce. What does that mean? Well, it means the Italian factories were not, I don't know if it's still the same, but I assume it hasn't changed greatly, just weren't efficient. I don't know why that is, but they are things to be taken in mind. Perhaps it's part of Italy's more general malaise, which again is heartbreaking to see. I do hope things improve. This has just been a talking point. It's not been in depth. So the whole point of it really is just to spark off a discussion. I'm sure there are many points that I've left out, and I really look forward to hearing from you in the comments about what you think is going wrong and what you think is going to happen going forward. Will Stellantis break this sort of trend? Will it improve? Or will these sort of manufacturers just slowly keep on shrinking? Thank you all so much for watching. I hugely appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe. It really helps. And from me, Jack, or Giacomo, I really look forward to seeing you for the next video, and thank you so much for watching.